We're a country where equalization is calculated on the basis of years, not of months, but obviously our hearts go out to Alberta, to folks who are suffering. That's why we had a good conversation around the First Minister's table last week, and why we're looking at ways we can support Premier Notley and the people of Alberta.
When one part of the country is not doing well, that affects every part of the country.
We feel that it's unreasonable for BC taxpayers to be sending money to the federal government to be distributed to provinces like Ontario through the Equalization program.
Canada is facing multiple crises, and public frustration continues to mount. These tensions have partly prompted Justin Trudeau's announcement that he will step down as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, though he will remain Prime Minister. To facilitate the leadership race for a new Liberal leader, Trudeau has also prorogued Parliament until the end of March. Despite this major development, dissatisfaction persists nationwide, particularly regarding policies and programs such as equalization payments. Last week, it was announced that $26.2 billion will be allocated in equalization payments, with $13.6 billion going to Quebec. This announcement has sparked outrage, especially in the western provinces, which will not receive any portion of the funds. François Legault, who campaigned in 2018 on a promise to reduce Quebec's reliance on equalization payments by fostering economic growth and wealth creation, appears to have abandoned this commitment, mostly notably by banning the exploitation of certain natural resources.
La péréquation, ça existe depuis le début du Canada. C'est dans la Constitution. Le Québec a droit à la péréquation. Mon objectif, c'est éventuellement de créer assez de richesses au Québec pour qu'on n'en ait plus besoin, mais ça peut prendre une vingtaine d'années avant d'y arriver. L'argent qui a été investi par le fédéral, que ce soit pour l'automobile en Ontario, que ce soit pour le pétrole dans l'Ouest. Donc, il faut tenir compte de tout ça. Bien, le message, c'est qu'on a droit à court terme à la péréquation. Il n'est pas question qu'on ajuste, qu'on change le modèle de la péréquation. Par contre, il est question au Québec qu'enfin, il y ait un gouvernement qui soit ambitieux pour créer de la richesse puis pour éliminer cet écart de richesse du Québec avec le reste du Canada.
Renaud Brossard, Vice President of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute, argues that equalization payments do not benefit provinces like Quebec in the long term, despite their significant share of the funding. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Brossard to explore and clarify the issues surrounding equalization payments in Canada.
So I think first off, the share of the payments and to which province they're going, this should come as no surprise because it's been the case for years and years and years. But essentially, the goal behind equalization initially was to make sure that every single province could give its citizens a certain basket of services. So it was sort of it was supposed to be a safety net for provincial governments that were not able to afford certain levels of services. Unfortunately, through the years and with the way the formula has been done, the amount of money that's been given through equalization has increased substantially to a point where now a lot of provinces see a significant part of their budget being paid through these federal transfers. And so we've got provinces, for instance, like Alberta and Saskatchewan, that are not getting any equalization dollars this year, and they haven't been getting any for quite a long time. I think Saskatchewan got some back in the 90s for a little bit, but they haven't gotten anything since. And then you've got other provinces, primarily eastern provinces, such as Quebec, but also Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, that have been getting equalization for years and years and years. And that's something that's been... There's been a growing resentment in the western provinces, in the provinces that don't get equalization and as such that contribute more to equalization towards this program. And it's been understandable. After all, nobody likes the idea of paying, like $26 billion this year to their neighbors. But one case that we have that we haven't heard enough is that equalization is also bad for the provinces that get equalization. The fact is that because of equalization, when a government makes a good decision, it doesn't get the full benefit of that good decision, but it also doesn't bear the full cost when it makes a bad decision. So take the Legault government's decision, for instance, to ban oil and gas exploration and exploitation activities in Quebec. Well, it is a bad decision. It is not. It is something that could have made Quebecers richer if we were able to get those jobs and to have our own domestic energy industry in Quebec. Unfortunately, because of that decision, the citizens are paying for it. They don't have as much opportunity as they would have otherwise. They don't have as good a salary as they would have otherwise. So there's a cost that has to be borne by the government in the sense that it doesn't get as much tax revenue, but it also doesn't pay the full cost because that is compensated with these significant equalization payments that could have gone down if revenue had gone up. And the same goes for a government that takes a good policy decision. Now, I know those don't happen as much, but when they happen, it means that governments don't bear the full benefit. So it skews that calculation quite a bit in the sense that governments in have-not provinces are unfortunately incentivized, or at least not as disincentivized to make bad policy decisions as they would be in the have provinces.
And there is also a growing frustration because Quebecers are receiving most part of the equalization payment, but also when the Western provinces hear that we are actually spitting on the oil and gas industry, saying we don't want them to be subsidized by our tax, or it's unclean energy. And at the end of the day, we receive a big check from it.
I think there needs to be a distinction here. It's not so much Quebecers seeing that as, unfortunately, their premier and their government. And there's a very big distinction. When we look at the people's attitude in Quebec towards oil and gas development, most of them are for it. We've done some surveys at the MEI, and we found that 48% of Quebecers are in favor of exploiting their own oil and gas resources, whereas there's only 30% against. So there's a significant spread. There's a spread of 18 points between those two answers. People are much more in favor of exploiting those resources. Unfortunately, when we look at the parties that are currently elected in the National Assembly, none of them actually say that they're in favor of exploiting those resources. I think the only exception, and unfortunately they don't have anybody elected, would be the Quebec Conservative Party. So when you have a situation like this, it shows that there's a disconnect between the government and the people on this. And honestly, part of it, not all of it, but part of it is certainly due to equalization and the incentives that it gives. If the government chose not to allow Quebecers to exploit their own energy resources, but was not getting equalization, it would have foregone a significantly larger amount of money than what is foregoing right now. But in any case, it has to bear the full political cost, just not the financial cost. And that does skew the decision, unfortunately.
One of the main reasons for not extracting our natural resources is to lower our production of CO2 and pollution, while we could actually reverse internationally the quantity of CO2 and pollution by extracting ourselves with better human and ecologic regulation on our natural resources.
Well, you know, that's a peculiar thing about greenhouse gas emissions and environmental policies, because greenhouse gas emissions do not stop at your border. There's no wall between the air and New Brunswick and that in Quebec. But unfortunately, when politicians look at environmental policy, they only look within their own borders. There's a really good report by the National Bank on this that found that if Canada was able to export enough natural gas to replace all of the coal being used in India, we could reduce global emissions by about 3 times as much as what we produce as Canada. It would have an impact 3 times bigger than if we shut everything down in the country for an entire year. And that goes to show that there's when we look at these environmental policies, if our objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we need to look at the impact that's further from our borders. And I think Quebecers understand this. The population in Canada, Canadians understand this. Canadians support the idea of exporting more of our resources, of exploiting those resources, of making sure that we have the good paying jobs that come with it, as a way to replace coal in emerging markets. But also as a way to help some of our allies, because every single barrel of oil or every single cubic meter of natural gas that we keep in the ground because of really bad legislation is just one more cubic meter of natural gas or one more barrel of oil that our hostile countries can export and get money from. Whether it is Russia, Iran, or Venezuela, every single time we take a policy to keep more oil in our ground and to keep more cubic meters of natural gas in our ground, they're salivating at the prospect of being able to sell just a little bit more of their products and being able to finance their hostile governments with that money. So we could help our allies, we could make significant amounts of money, and we could help achieve a greener world. This should be a win-win-win. It takes time to create lasting prosperity, but the problem with that logic is that if we don't start, we're just never going to achieve it. From a point of national pride as a Quebecer, I don't feel any pride in the fact that we're receiving equalization. I would much rather be in the have provinces and be with Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC and Newfoundland fighting to reform the program so that it can be something better. There's absolutely no pride in the fact that our government needs to be on what is essentially federal welfare. When we look at it, even from a nationalistic perspective, and we have a nationalistic government to an extent in Quebec, there should be an impetus for this. And that's also why, again, back in 2018, François Legault was talking about equalization zero being an objective. Now, that has been put on the back burner, unfortunately, but it's something that should be brought forward. And again, any step that goes in the right direction, that creates prosperity, that reduces progressively the share of equalization payments that Quebec gets would be a step in the right direction. I think every single party should aspire to do that. When it comes to federal representation, I understand the argument. I'm not sure how much that has to do with equalization, because again, the way equalization is calculated is a very complex formula. But essentially, what the government does, it sort of creates a synthetic province to look at what provincial governments would get on revenue on average if we looked at everything and put it together in one melting pot, and then it compares that with if Quebec had the same tax rates as that synthetic province. So it's not so much a political process. There's a political process to define the formula, but that formula gets tweaked every now and again. The issue is that the formula has been built in a way years and years and years ago, and there's been no significant enough reform. And over the years, what it has become is, instead of being, a safety net for the provinces, it has actually become something that props up their budget significantly, where they can now afford much more government programs than the other provinces that have taken the right steps to create wealth instead and create lasting prosperity.
In your own opinion, if we ever change the equalization payment formula, do you think Quebec will have to change how they run natural resources and everything into the province to make sure they can still afford to run the normal services to the citizens?
I think so. It's important to recognize that, sure, equalization is a significant part of the Quebec budget. Quebec spends about 160 billion a year. This year is going to get 13.5 billion. So it's a decent chunk of that budget. But the moment that money starts to go down, we're going to see some incentives from the government to actually look at creating more wealth instead of relying on those transfer payments. So it really is a matter of incentive, and I strongly believe that the moment that these checks start going down or that they stop growing, that we're going to have governments look at other ways to find the revenue that they need to fund those services. I think there's an extent to which taxes can't really be raised again in Quebec because we're already the most heavily taxed jurisdiction in all of North America and one of the most heavily taxed in the world. So there's a limit to how much more they can tax. But one thing that politicians can do and should look at is what they can do to create wealth. One of those avenues should be resource extraction. But there's a number of avenues. We at the EMI are kind of agnostic as to where that value needs to be created. What we want to see is governments reduce the many hurdles that prevent people from starting businesses and that prevent businesses from coming here, whatever the industry.
Justin Trudeau just announced that he's resigning, but not as Prime Minister, but as the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Most of you want an election now. We cannot wait to see our country falling apart before having an election. We have a petition called theelection.ca. On this website, you can sign it, share it, and also if you want to support our journalism, you can do so at the same website. And I repeat, it's called theelection.ca. Make your voice heard. We need election right now.